In my last video, I talked about how knowing the real breaking point in a negotiation can be the difference between caving under pressure and staying firm on what you know you can get. And that it really boils down to three key questions. What's the number? What's truly non-negotiable? And what's the drop-dead date? Well, here's how to figure it out. First of all, what's the number? Good negotiators spend some time up front making sure they understand their side's not to exceed number. But the really good ones also try to figure out the other side's number. Now, figuring out your side's number shouldn't be too difficult. Anyone going into a negotiation should know the most they're willing to pay for something or the least that they're willing to sell for. As for the other side, well, you may never find out what that specific deal breaker number is, and maybe they don't have one, but there are a few ways to find out what range you should be in. For buyers, their not to exceed numbers usually tied to a budget. Walk into any dealership to buy a car and the first question the salesperson is going to ask is, what's your budget? And it never ceases to amaze me how quickly internal stakeholders disclose their budget to a supplier and then try to justify paying a premium because the supplier was able to get the number to fit into our budget. Now, figuring out the seller's number is a little trickier, but it's not impossible. It just takes a little more research. Things like market rates, market share, competitive bids, and annual sales can help determine how low a supplier will go on price before they consider walking away. What's truly non-negotiable? The reality is that most standard legal terms are one-sided in favor of the party that drafted them, which means they're fair game in a negotiation. The real trick is to figure out how much you can modify a legal provision in your favor before it becomes unacceptable for your counterpart. Corporate lawyers, by their very nature, are risk averse. Their mandate is to protect the interests of the organization and mitigate as much risk as possible in a contract. Well, the problem is that the other side also has corporate lawyers trying to do exactly the same thing for their organization, which is why we should keep lawyers at the back table in our negotiations. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss legal terms as being overly cautious or accept them as holy words chiseled into stone. Instead, try to understand what specific risk is being mitigated by a particular clause, quantify the risk, and then negotiate the clause to a point where the risk is still being mitigated, but not at the expense of the overall deal. A good example of this is the data privacy clause. This is always a hot button topic, so each side will push language that obligates the other side to implement military-grade security protocols to ensure that there's no breach of their data. Sometimes that's called for, and if the other side pushes back, it could be a huge red flag. However, most of the time this language is overkill. It's designed to not only protect an organization from the obvious fallout of a data breach, but also as a catch-all for anything else that could happen. So understanding exactly what data will be exchanged and under what circumstances will enable negotiators to modify the clause so that it's acceptable for both sides. And finally, what's the drop-dead date? How many times have you heard that a contract has to be signed by the end of the week, or the month, or the quarter, or the year? The problem is that most organizations don't know what's driving them to that date. So the business puts pressure on their negotiator to get a deal done at the risk of leaving real value on the table. And I get that time is money, but in negotiations, the relationship between time and money is subjective at best. I've lost count of how many times my clients have told me that a deal needed to be done by a certain date, but they couldn't tell me why. In most cases, timelines in a negotiation are driven by a supplier's need to close a deal and book revenue before the end of a quarter or a fiscal year. However, there could be cases where a delay in the acquisition of goods or services could have an impact on projects or customers. When you're given the date to get a deal done, you should ask what will happen the day after we miss that date. If the answer is something along the lines of, well, the supplier won't offer the same discount, you know you can push as close to that date as possible without creating any real risk to the deal. However, If there are real downstream impacts to missing the date, then you should create your negotiating strategy accordingly. At the end of the day, your job as a negotiator is to get the best deal possible with the least amount of risk. Understanding the breaking point for each side will help you structure your negotiation strategy to achieve that goal. I can show you how to do that and a whole lot more in my negotiation training workshop. There's a new cohort starting in a few weeks. Sign up at oneviewnow.com/training or message me to discuss a corporate workshop for your team.